What shocking things did you find while clearing a deceased family member's room? Story 1. My grandma's house had money everywhere. Every purse had at least $100 in cash. Suitcases had a few hundred more. Every coffee can or other container in her kitchen had rolls of money. There were even bags of frozen vegetables in the freezer that had been split open with money hidden inside. And her bank accounts held thousands upon thousands of dollars. No one had any idea. She lived so simply and never spent on anything unnecessary. I'm sure her caution with money came from growing up during the Great Depression. It made for the most surprising scavenger hunt ever. Story 2. My dad's grandmother was a huge hoarder. When she passed away, he had to clear out her house, which was no easy task. My dad always tells us how you couldn't even see the walls because of the amount of things she had, and how she looked so small walking through the narrow pathways she had made between the piles of objects. After several days of clearing, my dad finally reached her bedroom. It was completely filled with all sorts of items, from around 20 different types of brooms to several harps she had bought during long trips to Europe. He found many surprising things, but the one that shocked him the most was a letter. He discovered it in her bedside table, sealed with wax with the words on the envelope, "To be opened by my daughter only after my death." My dad called his mom immediately since she was her only daughter. With her permission, he opened the envelope and found a letter and a birth certificate. In the letter, his grandmother explained that she had never been able to have children, and both she and her husband felt deeply saddened by it. They were devoted Catholics, living in early 20th century Mexico. She had always wanted a child, so they decided to take a long trip through Europe, from which they returned with a baby, my dad's mom. She had always looked a little different from her family, with very fair skin and the bluest eyes you could imagine. They found her in a nun-run orphanage in the north of France and immediately fell in love. Adoption was a big taboo then, so they told everyone she had become pregnant on their trip and given birth in Europe. They brought her back to Mexico and registered her as a newborn, even though she was already several years old. My grandmother lived her whole life believing she was her parents' biological child. At age 45, through this letter, she found out she had been adopted, that she was older than she thought, and that she was actually French, not Mexican. My dad had to tell her all this over the phone while trying to understand a French birth certificate. She eventually hired a private investigator and found her family in France. But that's another story. Edit. After several years trying to process what had happened, my grandma decided to search for her family to also help with claiming French citizenship. The detective found her biological mother and other relatives. After exchanging letters, it became clear her mother had no interest in meeting her, but surprisingly, her aunt did. Without ever having met before, the aunt traveled to Mexico and stayed for a few weeks. Through her, my grandma learned her mother's story. She had become pregnant at 16, out of wedlock, which was unacceptable at the time, especially in a small town. Her parents forced her to give the baby to the orphanage. This is likely why she didn't want to meet after so many years. My grandma's aunt stayed in contact for life, and my dad even stayed with her in Paris to learn French. Eventually, the adoption story spread in the family, with many admitting they had suspected something because of her striking blue eyes. Now my grandma tells the story lightly and is even happy to celebrate 2 birthdays instead of 1. Story 3. When my mother passed away, I was one of the people tasked with packing up our house. She had been dealing with a difficult ex-husband who would often come around uninvited. My mother knew, but she hadn't told anyone else. While we were taking things down, like pictures, we began finding items hidden behind them. Things like checkbooks for secret bank accounts, or even more unsettling, notebooks full of dates and accounts of times when he had confronted her. She had a restraining order against him. These entries described incidents like damage to her car, being followed and being approached during her daily routine. She had kept all of this from the family. What hurts most is thinking that if she had told everyone what was happening, things might have turned out differently. Story 4. My grandmother passed away after a blood clot. She had several health conditions that no doubt contributed to this. For example, her doctors had decided not to treat her breast cancer, believing it wouldn't progress before other health issues took her. My father, uncle, and sisters were left to clean out her apartment. We found a lot of expired food, like ketchup that had turned completely black. We also found things from when she was well and social, such as her quilting projects and handmade soaps, which were beautiful. One quilt had all our family members' names sewn in their own handwriting styles. One day it was just my dad and me going through her bedside table. We found her journal. Toward the end, the entries were all about how lonely she was, how she only saw her grandchildren twice a year, and how her own children rarely visited unless they needed something. She wrote that she no longer wanted to go on. My dad quietly threw it away so his brother would never have to read it. Story 5. When my grandmother passed, I helped clean up her things. I found a note from when she was with her second husband, who had died in 1995, that she had never given him. She had poured her heart out, saying she couldn't be with him anymore, that she knew the timing was difficult because he was unwell, but she was just emotionally exhausted. She must have changed her mind later, but it was hard to read something carrying so much of her pain and to realize she had been so unhappy during his last year. Edit for context. I believe this was a letter she wrote to cope with the stress of caring for someone sick who had become more irritable than usual. From what I've heard, he didn't handle pain well, but she never spoke ill of him later in life. She loved him, though their relationship was more companionate than romantic. Her true love had been my grandfather, who passed in the late 1970s. She was always warm and fairly happy when speaking of her second husband later on. I think the letter was her way of venting privately, avoiding saying hurtful things in the moment. It was surprising because she always spoke well of him, and no one in the family expected to find it. It didn't change how we saw her, but it was still hard to read. Story 6. After my dad passed away from alcohol-related illness, I went into his place expecting to prepare for the smell, but not for what I actually saw. I thought the people who removed his body would at least clean up a little or warn us to call someone ahead of time, but they didn't. I went in first to open the doors and windows, ready for the odor, but I wasn't ready for the signs that he had fallen while trying to get to his cell phone, which was just 2 feet away from him. On a lighter note, my dad had boxes filled with photos of my sister and me, along with items from his childhood. He never kept many possessions, just a few outfits and coffee mugs, so finding all those boxes of things I'd never seen before was unexpectedly heartwarming. I had thought he might have gotten rid of them long ago. I always knew he loved us, but he wasn't an openly sentimental person, so it really took me by surprise. Story 7. My best friend was killed in a car accident when he was 15. I was like another son to his parents, and a few weeks after his passing, his mother asked me to come over to help go through his belongings. We often shared clothes, so half of his closet was mine, including the shirt he had been wearing that day. When we entered his room, his mom handed me a duffel bag and told me I had 10 minutes to remove anything I didn't want her to see. I shut the door, gathered some things I had left there, and then we went through his belongings together, me taking back my clothes and her giving me his clothes that she knew I wore often. After a while, I decided to play some music. I turned on his stereo, pressed play, and Journeys Faithfully began. But after a few seconds over the song came my friend's voice, leaving a sweet, somewhat awkward message for a girl he had liked since 8th grade. I couldn't help but laugh. It was just so him. Once I started laughing, his mom began laughing and crying at the same time. She later told me it was the first time she had laughed since the accident and that it was a turning point for her in her grief. For me, it was just my best friend being goofy about a crush. Even after 31 years, I still think about him almost every day. Story 8. When my grandma passed, my husband and I cleaned out her house. She was a big-time hoarder, but in a very organized way. Everything neatly packed away in countless boxes and drawers. It took nearly 3 weeks to clear everything out, and along the way, I learned so much about her life that I'd never known. She had built a boat with her first fiancé before marrying my grandpa, and she had traveled the world, making friends with fascinating people, including a genuine member of African royalty with whom she had a long-term pen pal friendship. Among the things we found were beautiful pieces of jewelry and dresses she had saved as gifts for us, which we had never received. I also discovered that my dad had been a baby model for Sears, something revealed in newspaper clippings she kept. It was an emotional, surprising journey. In the end, her son sold most of the non-keepsake items in a garage sale, making nearly $4,000 with everything priced under $5, which gives you an idea of how much she had accumulated. She was the coolest, most spirited grandma, and I miss her every day. I'm grateful I got to learn so much more about her through her collections, though my dad might still call it junk. Story 9. My great-uncle was a truly kind man. He and my great-aunt had a couple of horses, and every morning he would open the window and call to them in his own horse language, and they would answer back. They lived in Casper, Wyoming. Back in the 1950s, he worked in the oil fields and would come home covered in oil every day. He loved people deeply. When the space station Mir was about to re-enter the atmosphere for the last time, he invited the whole neighborhood to watch it together. He kept a small Christmas tree in his living room year-round, decorated with pictures of friends he was praying for. If you met him, you wouldn't leave without him giving you a Susan B. Anthony quarter and a Buckeye, reminding you to be strong but always say your prayers. When I was about 8, he showed my sister and me something that fascinated us: his collection of authentic Chinese furniture. He explained that these pieces often had hidden compartments for storing valuables or important documents. Finding those secret compartments became one of my favorite childhood puzzles. I didn't know at the time, but my dad later told me my uncle had been very sick. Years of working in the oil fields had caused serious illness in his lungs, and he was in constant pain, though he never stopped showing kindness to others. A couple of years later, he passed away. After the funeral, I rushed into his bedroom to find one last secret compartment, and I did. Inside was $5,000 in $20 bills and a letter. In it, my uncle explained that he had grown too tired from the pain and had chosen to end his suffering. He described how he had traveled to Mexico with my great-aunt years earlier to obtain what he needed and had quietly made his choice. I don't think he told my great-aunt. Learning this shaped how I think about end-of-life decisions. I believe in God, and I believe my uncle was welcomed into peace. He was a man deserving of rest, and I share this because his life and his kindness deserve to be remembered. Story 10. In 2005, my sister passed away in a jet skiing accident on the lake. She was 11, I was 9, and after the funeral, my parents decided it was time to go through her things to pack them up and donate. I was allowed to help, mostly acting as a runner, bringing items to the living room while my parents sorted through everything in her room. The last thing she had said to me was, "I hate you." We had fought just before she got on the jet ski with my aunt, and that was the last time we spoke. While going through her belongings, I found a picture she had drawn of me, her and one of our other sisters, along with a little note expressing how much she loved her brothers and sisters. It was an art project for school, I think. That discovery helped put my mind at ease. I knew she truly loved me, and that if she had known those would be her last words to me, she would never have said them. Being 9 years old, watching her in the hospital for 3 days, then waiting 4 more days for the funeral before finding that picture, it was the hardest thing I had ever been through. But that picture helped me heal. Since then, I never leave anyone on bad terms after an argument. Not knowing if those might be the last words they hear from me, I can't in good conscience walk away without making things right. Story 11. When my grandpa passed away, we found a lot of things no one knew existed. Some were just photos of him during his time as a Navy captain in World War II, posing with women in the Pacific Islands. That was surprising, but not shocking. Then there was an extensive collection of Betamax tapes, at least 20 of them. My grandma, in disbelief, said, "I always wondered why he kept that Betamax. We only owned one movie, but the most unexpected find was the deed to a house no one in the family knew about. When my parents went to see the house, they found a woman living there, someone we had never met, who said she had been living there thanks to Grandpa's kindness. We later discovered that he had been paying the mortgage and depositing about $5,000 a month into her bank account. She turned out to be his partner, less than half his age. He was in his late 70s and she was 32. She had no idea he was married or had a family. She believed she was simply keeping a wealthy older man company. When he passed, she lost both her home and her income on the same day. It was heartbreaking for her, but the family's anger was aimed at him for betraying my grandmother and the rest of us. Harsh words were said to her in the heat of the moment, something I regret even now. I wanted to like my grandpa. After his obituary was published, we received over 200 letters from veterans saying he had saved their lives in the war. To them, he was a hero. I wish he had been a hero to me too. Story 12. When my grandmother's mother passed away, my grandma didn't get to help clear out her parents' home. She and my grandpa had moved several states away, and she couldn't afford the trip back for the funeral. She only visited months later, by which time her siblings had already gone through everything. She had made a list of items she wanted to keep: her mother's crochet projects, some dishware, antiques, and small keepsakes. But by the time she arrived, they had either been taken or sold. She managed to get a few pieces of silverware from her brother and a vase or two from a sister, but that was all. That is, until she visited another sister's house and saw that she had their mother's flour bowl, a wooden bowl hand-carved by their father, used daily to make biscuits and other baked goods. Her sister, who never baked, planned to use it as a planter. After what must have been a tense discussion, My grandma walked away with the flower bowl and took it home. She has used it for baking ever since, just as her mother had. She has already promised it to me one day, and I know I'll treasure it as much as she has. Story 13. When I was 26, my friend was diagnosed with cancer. He went through chemotherapy, but it wasn't working, so he had to move back in with his parents. About a month after moving in, I stopped by to check on him. While I was there, he asked me if I could go to his house and bring him his computer. He told me, "Call me before you go inside. There's something I need you to do." A few days later, I went to pick up the computer and called his parents' house, but they said he was sleeping. I wondered what he wanted me to do, and for some reason, I knew it was to remove something personal from his house. After loading his computer into my car, I searched for the stash I thought he might be referring to. It took a while, but I found it and removed it. Later that day, I dropped off the computer at his parents' house, and they told me he was still asleep and would call me later. When he called, I told him what I had done, and he confirmed that's exactly what he had wanted. About a month later, he passed away. I was heartbroken, but I felt honored that he trusted me to take care of something so personal for him, so his parents wouldn't have to be the ones to find it. Story 14. My grandfather served in the Navy during World War II, stationed in the Pacific. After both he and my grandmother passed away, we began the big task of cleaning out their small ranch house, where my dad and uncle had grown up. My grandmother, a child of the Great Depression, never threw anything away. Her house was always tidy, but hidden away, we found boxes of metal hair curlers in the bathroom ceiling, home-canned peaches from 1976 in a secret cupboard, and cash tucked into the pages of books. She had carefully preserved the things my grandpa brought back from his service. However, under their bed, we found a shoebox with "Do Not Open" written on the lid. Naturally, we opened it. Inside were photo booth pictures of my grandfather with a very pretty young woman. My grandmother had written angry words on them and in some had colored over the woman's face. I don't know why he brought those pictures home or why she kept them under their bed, maybe for future arguments. It could have been upsetting, but honestly, it wasn't a shock. He had always been something of a ladies' man, and she was fiery enough to keep him in check. They were married for 65 years before she passed away, and he was never the same afterward. Even though it was a bit scandalous, it was fascinating to see them as young, passionate, and imperfect. I miss them both all the time. Story 15. I work in a retirement community. When someone passes away with no family, a company comes in about a week later and clears everything out, throwing it all away. Since I have a master key, I sometimes go into these units beforehand to rescue meaningful items. I'm not a collector and I'm not looting. Everything I take gets donated to local charities, the residents' church, or the historical society. Over time, I found some interesting things: coin and stamp collections, old medications, personal items, military records, including some from World War II Germany, and even antique weapons. Elderly people often have lived lives far more adventurous than we realize. The first time I read a diary, though, was heartbreaking, and I've never done it again. I hadn't formed close bonds with most residents, but Mary was different. She always found time to chat, tell jokes, and offer me a drink when I came by to fix something. She was full of life and warmth. After she passed, I found her diaries, a dozen volumes covering her life from her 20s until the day before she died. She had included photographs of herself throughout the years, and her writing was powerful and emotional. In her early years, she wrote with hope about finding her soulmate, sharing poetry, reflections, and personal experiences. By her early 50s, she had given up on that dream, and her writing became sparse and subdued. But in the last 2 years of her life, her words came alive again. She wrote passionately about a much younger man who had reignited something in her, someone she described as attractive, kind, and quietly confident. She never named him, but I realized the timing matched when I began working there. I don't know how to feel about it, flattered, sad, and a bit lost. Mary was an extraordinary person, but I only came to understand that after she was gone. I'm grateful I could brighten her final years, but part of me wishes I had known sooner. Story 16. I became friends with an older gentleman who had no family or friends. He moved to our area, and one Sunday after church, I started a conversation with him. We stayed in touch for about 3 years. I would take him to doctor's appointments, and I think he enjoyed having someone around to keep an eye on him. He became very ill with pneumonia, and since I was the only person in his phone, The hospital called me to let me know he was in a bad state. Being there with him in his final moments was an incredible and humbling experience, and I was glad he wasn't alone. Afterwards, since I was his only contact, his solicitor asked if I would clean out his apartment. While sorting through his things, I found his will and some documents. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he had some rare coins, around $50,000 in a bank account and over $300,000 in shares. His will stated that it was to be divided among certain charities. However, in his diary, I found that he had planned to meet with his solicitor the following week to change his will and make me the sole beneficiary. I simply chose not to dwell on it and moved on, eventually finding an old box of photos, some showing him dressed in a way that surprised me, given his very devout public persona. Story 17. My wife was never much of a gift giver. It stemmed from the way she was raised. Her parents constantly worried about money, which made her and her siblings very cautious about spending. You didn't buy anything that wasn't a necessity. Early in our marriage, I tried giving her flowers, candy, jewelry, and perfume, but she would return what she could and get upset about what she couldn't. She saw it as a waste. Over the years, I received fewer than 10 gifts from her for Christmas, birthdays, and Father's Day, and never anything for Valentine's Day. Eventually, I learned to give her practical gifts like appliances or clothing she could use, which she genuinely appreciated. She tried to overcome her difficulty with spending, but for the first 2 decades of our 29-year marriage, I worked construction and earned very little, which didn't help. About 20 years in, I went back to college, earned a degree in medicine, and started making a much better income. She began to accept and even enjoy flowers and cards for special occasions, though she still rarely bought me gifts. She passed away from breast cancer 9 years ago. While going through her belongings, I found 2 things that touched me deeply. Behind a drawer in her jewelry box was a $100 bill. Odd that she had misplaced it, but perhaps not so odd given her relationship with money. The other was a romantic Valentine's Day card in her dresser, addressed specifically to my husband. I think she bought it but never had the chance to give it to me. Finding it meant a lot during a very difficult time. Story 18. My father was a successful businessman from Detroit. He grew up in a tough neighborhood but managed to get into a good school, earn an engineering degree, and eventually own his own machine shop. Things went well until the 2008 financial crash, which brought a lot of stress. Shortly after I left for college, my mother convinced him to enter rehab for alcoholism. He managed a few weeks sober before relapsing, twice more after that. He began acting aggressively and driving under the influence. My mother divorced him, and he isolated himself in an apartment before eventually drinking himself to death. While cleaning out his apartment, I found piles of rehab literature. I didn't want to know every detail, but I didn't want to throw out anything important for handling the estate. Among the papers was a worksheet where he had written a timeline of his relationship with drugs and alcohol. I learned that he had first tried meth at age 13, started smoking cannabis at 11, and by 14 was smoking daily and drinking on weekends. It was a shock, but it explained a lot. I can't imagine growing up in an environment where parents ignored or didn't notice that. Despite everything, I'm grateful he found a way to raise me in a more stable and structured environment than the one he had known. Story 19. A close friend of our family, almost like a stepfather to me, though he and my mother were never together, had ongoing heart problems. After getting a pacemaker, there were complications in surgery. The doctor said it wasn't life-threatening, but might cause discomfort. Before that, he had been full of energy, active in the community, helping kids leave gang life behind. He loved video games, especially for someone in his late 50s. One night while visiting, we talked about Metal Gear Solid 4. He said he couldn't get past a part where you had to follow someone without being detected. I told him about a trick I had seen in a speedrun. Injure the target and then follow them at a slower pace. Later that night, he went home early, saying his chest hurt, and told my mother he loved her. The next morning, I woke up to my mother screaming. Outside, there were police and paramedics. He had passed away during the night. Some believed it was due to his health. Others thought it might have been from taking too much pain medication. The only bittersweet comfort I found was seeing his television still on in power save mode. He had gotten past that part of the game we had talked about earlier. It made me smile through the tears, knowing he had that small victory before the end. Story 20. My grandmother had an old friend who lived in the apartment above hers for about 50 years. She had no close family nearby. Her 2 adult daughters were in other countries, and her husband had passed away many years earlier. When she passed, her family asked us to go upstairs, clean, and take an inventory of her belongings. What we found was unusual and sad. She had been a kind of doomsday prepper, owning 16 or 17 large steel cupboards, each about 4 feet by 3 feet by 7 feet. Inside were all sorts of supplies, one cupboard full of canned food, another with medical supplies. That was a little eccentric, but still understandable. Then we found one cupboard filled entirely with small denomination banknotes, still wrapped from the bank. She had withdrawn a large sum in small bills and never used them, and some were so old they were no longer in circulation. Another cupboard contained only alcohol, premium bottles including single malt whiskeys and expensive vodka. Only one cupboard held clothes. What made this sad was how she passed. She had slipped and fallen, unable to get up for an entire weekend until my grandmother realized she hadn't heard from her friend in a couple of days. When we checked on her, she was still conscious but very weak, and she passed in the hospital a day later. She had been surrounded by supplies meant for emergencies, but none of it could help in the moment she truly needed it. Story 21. My grandmother had 3 children, including my mother, and all of us were very close to my aunt. We often visited her at the old family home, which had been in the family for 3 generations. Over time, she developed dementia, and eventually cancer returned. She passed away in that house. Since no one was going to move in, we began sorting everything to either donate, discard, or divide among family members. My aunt was a lesbian, something my family had known but never really discussed openly, especially in my grandmother's day, when it wasn't as widely accepted. Still, our family loved her, and it was simply an unspoken fact. I never brought it up with her, though I always felt a personal connection, being the first and only openly gay person in the family in 2 generations since her. While cleaning her closet, I found a typed memoir she had written, detailing her experiences as a lesbian through the decades. My mother wanted to destroy it, but I kept it. Reading it gave me a deeper connection to her and to that part of my family history which had never been talked about openly. The years had softened some of the hardships she described, but it gave me a window into her life and into a past that I felt was worth preserving. Story 22. My brother passed away last year, and going through his belongings was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He didn't leave a note, but he was an aspiring musician, and we found his song lyrics. I never would have guessed he was in such a dark place from the things he wrote. His words felt both hopeless and resigned, though he had hidden those feelings from us completely. I stayed up all night with those lyrics running through my mind. Later, I returned to his room alone, trying to take it all in, and found a hidden notebook with more writing. In it, he expressed sorrow for how his decision would affect my sister and placed some blame on my mom for his feelings. I struggled for hours over whether to remove that page, knowing it would devastate her to read it. What hurt me most was realizing, after seeing his words about my sister, that there was nothing addressed to me, no final message, nothing personal to hold on to. I searched through everything, hoping for even a few words meant for me, but I never found them. Story 23. When my brother passed, he was living alone. He had a girlfriend, but she lived elsewhere, and she wanted no part in cleaning out his house. The rest of my family wasn't close to him, so the responsibility fell entirely on me. He had been my best friend and my closest companion, so being in his home so soon after was a deeply unsettling experience. In his bedroom, I found the usual things, magazines, personal items, but then I turned to the wall of shoe boxes he had always kept stacked high. I had never really thought about it before, but he only owned a few pairs of shoes. Opening the boxes, I discovered they were all filled with money, nothing smaller than $20 bills. Every box was completely full, about 50 boxes in total, each holding roughly $5,000. Altogether, it was around $230,000. I have no idea where he got it, though I assume he earned it, given how casually it was stored. I didn't tell anyone. They hadn't been there for him when he needed them and didn't care to help with his final affairs. I've kept it all safe and plan to use it to buy a house for my wife and me. I see it as a way to honor his memory for years to come and to remain grateful for the brother I had. Story 24. I discovered my grandmother had been an unwed mother when I found her real marriage certificate. She had lied about the year she and my grandfather were married, claiming it was a year earlier than it actually was. We had no pictures of their wedding in a church, only one of them in a family member's living room after the ceremony and a picture of a small cake. My grandmother had always said the film got exposed, and that's why there were no photos. She wore a pink wedding dress, which I'd always found strange, but she told me her sister had bought it for her. The truth was, there had been no church wedding because she wasn't allowed to marry in the church, and she couldn't wear white. Coming from a small town, her family had sent her away to a friend's farm a few hours away during her pregnancy and birth. The wedding was arranged in someone's living room when my grandfather returned from the Air Force on leave. She kept the secret her entire life. I think only her brother-in-law knew, and he never told anyone, not even when we celebrated what we thought was their 50th anniversary, which was actually their 49th. I found out while cleaning her closet and going through her "when I die" binder. The dates didn't match what I had seen on forms, so I did the math and realized why. My mom and her siblings were shocked. Story 25. My father passed away 4 years ago, though it feels like it just happened. It was sudden, a heart attack, and he'd never had any heart issues or even smoked. The night before, he said he had terrible chest pain and couldn't lie down comfortably. We had no idea it could be a heart attack. He even joked that he was going to die, and we laughed. After a sleepless night for him, I left for class in the morning, and just 15 minutes later, I got a message telling me to come home. He hadn't wanted to go to the hospital that night, and in a way, I'm glad. He passed away, surrounded by the things he loved instead of in a room full of strangers. It's especially hard because we had just started getting along really well after a difficult period during my high school years. After his passing, we found out he hadn't been paying taxes for 4 to 5 years, so the fees fell on us. It almost made me laugh because he'd always hated the government. My biggest fear now is forgetting his voice, since I have no recordings of him, but I think it will always stay with me, even if time makes it harder to recall. Story 26. I found out, after my mother passed, that she had been lying to me for years about many things, the biggest being who my brother's father was. I had always believed it was my dad, until one day when I was about 13, she told me my brother's father was actually a close family friend. I was shocked, but I believed her. He did look a bit like my brother, and at the time I didn't think much more of it. When she passed away, I was cleaning out her filing cabinet and found a paternity test she had done on that family friend. It clearly stated he was not my brother's father. From what I could tell, he had never seen those results because I also found receipts showing he had been paying $800 a month in child support, while my dad was paying $300 per child. She had been telling them both they were my brother's father to get money from each of them. This discovery unraveled even more lies. I spoke to both men and learned just how many false stories my mom had told me. It hurt deeply. Even 6 years later, I still wonder how much of my life was based on things she invented. Story 27. My husband passed away recently, and cleaning out his closet has been an ongoing project for the last 2 months. For his last birthday, I took our kids to the dollar store and let them each pick out 27 items for him since he was turning 27. They were toddlers and thought it was the funniest thing ever, so I filmed the whole process and showed my husband. While sorting through his closet, I found a lot of dollar store bags, which was odd since we never really shopped there. Going through them, I discovered that for each child, he had prepared years' worth of birthday gifts, 1 item for the baby's first birthday, 2 for the second, 3 for the third, and so on. There was even a full welcome home baby package for the child born after he passed away. He had also written letters for each birthday, though I haven't been able to open them yet. I know he meant for me to find them, knowing I'd find it funny and meaningful, and I hope our kids will too one day. It was completely unexpected, overwhelming, and emotional. Even though our children won't remember him personally, moments like this remind me how lucky they are to have had him as their father. Story 28. My grandmother passed away at the age of 108. She had lived a long life and remained relatively healthy until the end. The arrangement in our family was that her 3 sons, all in their 60s and 70s, would each take turns caring for her for 4 months at a time in their own homes. When she passed, she was staying at my dad's house, so I helped clean out her room. I had deep respect for her. She had been illiterate, worked her whole life on a farm, lived with dirt floors, and used a pit latrine until the mid-1990s. Her life had been full of challenges, but she endured with strength. As I went through her dresser, I found a small keychain, a snowman encased in clear rectangular plastic. It seemed out of place among her hairbrushes and makeup, especially since she never had keys of her own. She was always driven by someone else and didn't need them. I turned it over in my hands, curious, and noticed her youngest daughter's name engraved at the bottom. My heart sank when I realized what it meant. Her youngest daughter had passed away in a car accident in the 1980s on another continent, and she was buried there. I don't know how my grandmother came to have her daughter's keychain, but she must have treasured it, holding on to that small piece of her for decades. It was a quiet, unspoken expression of her grief and love that she kept with her until the very end. Story 29. My father developed diabetes around the time I was born, and much of my childhood was spent in ER rooms because he didn't manage it well. When I was 8, after his first heart attack, my oldest brother asked him if he really didn't want to live to see my quinceañera. The following year, my father decided to move us to Mexico, where he owned property and wanted to spend his final years. While there, he began taking better care of himself, lost weight, and seemed healthier. Around that time, one of my brothers began dating a woman who eventually moved into our home while my brother worked in the U.S. Our house was big enough that we didn't see her much, but she and my father became involved. I caught them together more than once, and they threatened to pull me out of school and make me work in the markets if I told my mother. My father's priorities shifted. He began traveling with her, leaving me alone for days, and his health declined again. She used drugs in the house, practiced unsettling rituals, and tried to turn me against my mother. My father passed away when I was 18. By then, I was living with my mom in the U.S., and although I had told her about his relationship, he denied it, and my brother refused to believe me. My brother was living with him when he passed, but didn't inform us right away. We still haven't been able to enter my father's home because my brother's now wife has legal rights as a resident. It's been 3 years, and the inability to properly say goodbye has left the grief unresolved. My mother's working with lawyers to reclaim the property, and I'm waiting for the day we can finally let my father rest in peace. Story 30. My mom passed away after a long battle with lung failure. For a short time, she moved in with extended family in another state with a better climate, and her health improved. The plan was for the rest of us to join her within a year, but just 2 weeks later, my brother nearly died from a sudden brain infection, requiring multiple surgeries. My mom moved back to help care for him, but her own health quickly declined, and she passed soon after. While going through her belongings, I found her diaries and decided to look for her entry from the night before my brother became critically ill. In it, she wrote that my father had claimed to see a dark, human-like shape in his room that gave off an overwhelming sense of menace before disappearing. The very next day, my brother's life was in danger from a mysterious medical emergency doctors could never fully explain. That event set off the chain of circumstances that eventually led to my mom's passing. Standing there in the basement with that diary in hand, I was stunned, especially because we had witnessed something similar years before. For a while, I felt like we were cursed. In the end, I chose not to tell my dad or my siblings. I hid that diary, believing it was better not to frighten anyone further during an already devastating time. Story 31. My dad had an impressive hidden collection of pipes, rolling papers, and other smoking accessories, along with items designed to disguise them, like shaving cream cans with secret compartments. I knew about most of it and tried to get rid of as much as I could before my mom found it after he passed. But he was creative. Things were hidden everywhere. In the attic, under the house, in hidden compartments in his van, false panels in the walls, even secret drawers at the family business. Every so often, my mom would find something and ask me what it was, and I'd make up some explanation about it being a travel gadget or collectible. In recent years, I realized she probably wouldn't have been as upset about it as I'd thought, especially after seeing her support relatives using medicinal cannabis. Eventually, I told her everything, including the fact that even though he had promised her before marriage that he'd stop, he had continued for decades. She just laughed and said she had suspected it all along and that maybe it had even made him easier to live with. Then she took me to the shed to show me a beautiful 3-foot-tall purple and clear glass piece she'd been trying to use as a vase. But she couldn't keep water in it because it kept leaking out of a hole near the bottom. Story 32. My brother lived alone in a small apartment. When no one had heard from him for a few days, my mom asked me to check on him. It was winter and almost dark when I arrived. The doors were locked and there was no answer, so I had to break in. The living room was dim and eerily empty except for scattered trash. The windows were completely covered and the air smelled stale. As I walked toward the back, I realized the stillness in the apartment was hiding something I wasn't prepared for. My brother had passed away in his bedroom. The scene was deeply disturbing, and I'll never forget the silence in that place. When I returned later to gather his belongings, my dad waited outside, unable to go in. The room still carried the marks of what had happened: abandoned personal items, signs of his final days and his note. Among his belongings, I found notebooks he had partially burned, filled with dark and troubling thoughts, and detailed plans that suggested he had been struggling with much more than we knew. It was an overwhelming discovery and one that still weighs heavily on me. Story 33. My grandmother passed away due to complications from a stroke. She had been a big part of my dad's life, and as he got busier with work, I took over driving her to get groceries or to go see a movie. After she passed, my dad and I cleaned out her condo together. It was a solemn task, and we both found things we wished we hadn't. In her kitchen, I discovered unopened groceries I had bought for her, many of her favorites, suggesting she hadn't been eating well in the months before her stroke. In her sewing room, I found abandoned projects with mistakes she had hidden away, possibly feeling too frustrated to finish. My grandmother, who was of Japanese heritage, had always been careful not to be a burden, though she was never anything but a joy to our family. I also found her meticulously kept financial records, which spanned 70 years, written in elegant handwriting, until the last few years, when they became disorganized and hard to read. One discovery that really stayed with me was a manila envelope full of word puzzles from the daily paper. For years, she had solved them easily, but these had either been left blank or were filled out in the same shaky handwriting as her final financial entries. It was a quiet sign of her declining health. I still do those puzzles every day, just as she did, and every time I solve one, I think of her and how time eventually takes its toll on all of us. Story 34. My gran is still alive, but she has end-stage Alzheimer's and has been in a nursing home for some time. It was my dad who cleaned out her house before it was sold to pay for her care, which is common practice in the UK. While doing so, he found a lot of drawings I had made as a child. One in particular stood out. It was a picture of me, my younger sister, and my gran picking us up for school, and in the drawing my smile was huge. Seeing it made me cry. He also found the glass swan ornaments she used to display when I was little. They weren't valuable, but I adored them, and she always said she'd give them to me one day. She had stopped displaying them years ago and redecorated multiple times, but she had still kept them for me. That meant a lot, especially since I hadn't been able to see her after I was about 4 or 5 because of a difficult family situation. Even though her health and memory have declined to the point where she's no longer the person I remember, finding those things was a reminder that she had kept her promise and remembered me. Story 35. About 10 years ago, my best friend's mother passed away unexpectedly. She had been living alone after her husband died from cancer 6 months earlier. My friend was devastated, so I flew in to help him clean out her house and plan the memorial. The shocking discovery came when, alongside her belongings, the police and coroner found tall cannabis plants in her backyard and a large bag of it prepared for sale. My friend had no idea his sweet, elderly mother had been supplementing her retirement income this way. While we were packing, my friend quietly pulled me aside and showed me a duffel bag filled with more of it, easily several pounds. That evening, after the other helpers left, we decided to try a little in her honor. It was incredibly strong, and we both ended up laughing late into the night. The next day, while continuing to clean, I opened the fridge in the garage and was stunned. It was full of more of the same, including the freezer and drawers. Altogether, there was easily over 10 pounds of high-quality product. My friend, needing to drive home across multiple state lines, didn't want to risk traveling with it, so he left it with a trusted neighbor who had been aware of the growing operation. We never found out exactly what happened to it, but we like to imagine she enjoyed it with friends or perhaps sold it and used the money for something fun. Something my friend's mom would have approved of. Story 36. My dad passed away 15 years ago, and my feelings toward him are still complicated. I always knew he was a private man who kept a lot to himself, but I didn't realize just how much until after he was gone. When we went through his things, we found evidence of a long-term relationship with another woman. Letters and audio tapes he had recorded for her, expressing deep feelings. It was devastating to listen to them, and I ultimately destroyed the tapes because I felt nothing good could come from them. They were found in an unsealed envelope addressed to her, alongside letters. We didn't discover this until after the funeral, so when I met her there, I had no idea who she really was. In hindsight, that might have been for the best. My mom had suspected something over the years, but never had proof. My dad had passed unexpectedly from a heart attack while they were on a vacation for their 30th anniversary, coincidentally in the same place where this woman lived. My mom had even had lunch with them both just days before. There are so many unanswered questions I've chosen to leave alone. We also found items showing different religious affiliations. He had been baptized as a Jehovah's Witness for my mom, but also kept Catholic items hidden away. He owned guns we didn't know about, including one in his car, and had several hidden bank accounts and insurance policies. While the secrecy upset my mom, it turned out he had also set up a lot financially to ensure she'd be cared for if something happened to him. He was far from perfect and lived parts of his life in ways we'll never fully understand. Our relationship was complex when he was alive, and I've decided to let the rest of the unknowns stay that way. Story 37. My grandparents divorced long before I was born, and their separation was bitter. They never spoke, and when they unexpectedly saw each other at my sister's wedding more than 25 years later, my grandfather simply turned and walked away. Over time, I learned that my uncle, their youngest son, was believed by my grandfather to have been fathered by another man. My grandfather discovered this when my uncle was a teenager, and their relationship ended there. After they divorced, my grandmother and uncle went one way, and my grandfather another. They never reconnected, and my grandfather passed away without seeing him again, or so we thought. While going through my grandfather's belongings, my sister and I found keepsakes related to my uncle, including his high school graduation program with his name circled. He had attended the ceremony quietly, staying in the back so my grandmother and uncle wouldn't see him. When my uncle came to the funeral, it was the first time he'd been near his father in almost 40 years. I was able to tell him that his dad had cared, showing him the graduation program as proof. It was bittersweet, so much love lost over decades, but I was grateful I could share that truth with him. Story 38. My grandmother had been living with COPD for as long as I could remember, a result of smoking in her younger years. Over time, I watched her abilities slowly fade, from walking around without issue, to getting winded just going down the stairs, to eventually needing an oxygen tank around the clock, along with increased nebulizer treatments, and finally relying on a motorized chair. It was hard to see, and it became a constant reminder for me of why I never smoked or used anything that could harm my lungs. She herself often told us to take her as an example of what could happen. Eventually, she caught pneumonia, which made her very ill and required her to move into an assisted living facility. After her pneumonia cleared, she was given permission to return home, but not long after, she passed away from a heart attack, likely worsened by lingering complications from pneumonia and her already fragile condition. My uncle, her son, was the one who found her, and it deeply affected him. That whole period was incredibly difficult for our family. When we cleaned out her apartment, we found something unexpected. Stashed behind her dresser was a half-empty pack of cigarettes. As much as I wanted to believe it might have been an old keepsake from decades ago, the fact that she had only lived in that apartment for a year or two made it hard to think it just happened to be there by chance. It was a bittersweet find, both a reminder of her struggles and a part of her story we hadn't known. Story 39. I was working as a mortician at the time, and I had been in this job for a few years before the small company I worked for was bought by a much larger one in France. I remember one particular case involving a young boy. We had a tradition of drawing straws to decide who would handle children's services because they were always the most emotionally difficult and no one ever volunteered. This time my team and I lost. We went to collect him from the Necker Hospital in Paris, which specializes in pediatric care. We arrived early to ensure everything would be done perfectly, as we knew the family would be on edge that day. I was usually the one who prepared the bodies after receiving them from the morgue, so I gently moved him from the cold storage to the preparation table. He was so small that I was careful with every movement, worried about causing damage. His legs were curled to one side and his head was turned slightly, which would later become important. The thanatopractor had done an excellent job. His face was preserved perfectly. Even his tiny nose was intact thanks to careful work. His hands were clean and easy to arrange, and aside from the position in which he had been preserved, everything was in good condition. The family had brought clothing for him, so I dressed him with care. Though because of the way he had been positioned, it was especially difficult to put on the trousers. Still, I managed without undoing any of the careful preservation work. I fixed his hair neatly and gave him a gentle, peaceful expression, a little mortician's trick that tends to bring some comfort to grieving families. Everything was going well until we tried to place him in the coffin. Because of the way he had been preserved, his legs and head wouldn't fit properly. Just then, the ceremonial master came in to say, "The family is here. Hurry. We had to act quickly. Using one of our warm coats, we wrapped it strategically around his legs to adjust their position. For his head, we rolled another coat into a small support and placed it under his ear to keep it aligned. We then used the blanket and other items the family had brought to conceal the adjustments. The coffin closed perfectly, and there were no delays. The family never noticed anything unusual, and the ceremony went smoothly. Somewhere, that boy rests with two of our warm coats, perhaps not the most remarkable items, but they made it possible for us to give his family a dignified farewell. Story 40. I had an employee who lived at my workplace in a small one-bedroom space with a kitchen and bathroom. It had once been a locker room before he made it his home. He was a friendly man, always smiling, and he worked extremely hard doing very difficult tasks. We handled the collection and processing of animal remains for hides, which was tough work. One Wednesday night, a driver mentioned to me that he'd been acting strangely after hours, but I didn't think much of it at the time. By Saturday, my dad called to tell me something had happened. He hadn't been seen for days, and when they couldn't get into his room, they removed the window unit and found he had passed away. The police came, and afterward, my father, being unwilling to hire a professional cleanup service, told me the responsibility would fall to me. While I was cleaning, another employee mentioned that he had quite a bit of cash hidden in his room. I began searching his belongings and found around $3,000, but as I went through more of his things, I began to feel an overwhelming sadness. I found papers from past stays in mental health facilities, notes from times he had been under observation, and informational flyers about basic personal care. There were more than 50 hats, as many pairs of jeans, unopened school notebooks, art supplies, and countless pencils and sharpeners. It dawned on me that he likely had very limited formal education and may have been introduced to harmful substances at some point, which left lasting effects. Despite his challenges, he was vulnerable, gentle, and seemed to carry a childlike innocence. Among his belongings, I also found religious pamphlets and letters from a group that seemed more interested in his money than in truly helping him. He was clearly trying to improve himself and find hope, but it seemed he had been fighting a battle entirely on his own. In the end, we finished cleaning the room, though no one has lived in it since. We located his sister through one of his journals and gave her both his belongings and the money. She had no idea where he had been or how he had been doing. I still think of him often, his laughter while working, his kindness despite hard circumstances, and the way he found joy in small moments. His absence left a quiet space in our workplace, but his memory stays with me. Story 41. I come from a very traditional household. I'm Native American Lakota, and in our culture, when someone passes away, we burn their clothes and the things they slept on to help them cross over into the next life. We're allowed to keep small items like trinkets, memorabilia, and other meaningful keepsakes. When my grandmother passed, she left behind 9 children, more than 60 grandchildren, and over 30 great-grandchildren. Everyone believed she was recovering in the hospital, and she was even supposed to come home the very next day, but she didn't make it. She wasn't a hoarder, but she kept important documents, everyone's birthdays, stacks of cards ready to give out, and all kinds of letters addressed to family members. She never kept a journal to record her personal thoughts, but she had memories and stories connected to each of us. The weekend she passed, our entire family came together from all over the country. The first time in more than a decade. The last time she had tried to gather us was for a Christmas dinner in 2005. But that reunion had ended emotionally, with her in tears. This time, as the women of the family sorted through her drawers and boxes, we found pieces of her connection to each of us. I was given a cup she bought for me when I was accepted to KU, a symbol of how proud she was. There was also a damaged Polaroid she had taken when I got my driver's license, back when I was working on my associate's degree before transferring to a 4-year college. My cousin received a photo from when he made it into Sports Illustrated for basketball. Another cousin had a keepsake from a beauty pageant, and someone else had a CD marking a Grammy nomination for world music. Going through these items was like stepping into her boundless positivity and hope for all of us. We knew that with her passing, we had lost the constant support she gave. But we also shared our memories with each other in private, strengthening the family bond she always valued. When the funeral came, even more people attended. The first night of the wake, we actually ran out of food, and people waited outside in their cars for their turn to enter the gymnasium, which could hold more than 500 people. When we brought her from the funeral home, the procession of cars stretched for nearly 10 miles. She had touched so many lives and earned the respect of so many people. It was a truly beautiful way to send her on to the next life. Story 42. I recently went through my dad's belongings. He had worked in the military, so you might expect his things to be serious and strictly professional. But when we received his office items, they were filled with personality, Santa hats, submarine-shaped tea diffusers, and countless photos of my sister and me. His wallet still held pictures of us as little kids, the same ones we placed with him when we cremated him. The most surprising discovery was in a suitcase in his wardrobe that he didn't like anyone touching. Inside were valuable and sentimental items, 21st birthday cards, baby photos, and even a journal he had kept from 1981 to 1986. Those pages spanned 3 different relationships and all of his military training. In one entry, he poured out his heartbreak after being dumped, and there were visible watermarks on the page. Just a month later, he wrote about meeting a new girlfriend, my mom, and how he was certain he would marry her. The journal also revealed personal history I hadn't known. He wrote about feeling let down by his parents and sisters, how they asked him not to write while he was away at military school, how they showed no excitement when he announced his engagement, and how relieved he was to move away from them. Reading that helped put a lot into perspective, especially since those same relatives have acted like they were deeply close to him after his passing, despite their distance when he was alive. My favorite part of the journal was how casual it was at times. Complaints about his drill sergeant, descriptions of tough days, little slices of daily life. There were a few entries I skipped because they were more personal than I wanted to know, but overall, it was incredible to have his words from when he was my age. It gave me a window into the kind of person he was and showed me how much of him lives on in me.